Okay, there we go. So the session is now recording. And again, we would just ask that you keep your video and microphone off throughout the presentation. If you do have questions or comments, those are welcome, and you can add those to the chat box. If you prefer to remain anonymous, you are able to change your name by clicking on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You should be able to change the name that's on your screen if you want to be anonymous within the chat. So my name is Sheila Bourgeois, and I am the Bereavement and Wellness Coordinator at Hospice Peterborough. And I just am so excited that you've all joined us tonight. Tonight, I have the honor of presenting with Alice Citrum. Alice, do you want to say hello and introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And I'm Alice Citrum. I'm one of the facilitators for Grief Chat that's offered by Hospice, which is a grief support group. So thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to spending this evening with you all.
Thank you, Alice. I also want to acknowledge in starting that this first session is falling on Canada's National Bereavement Day. And so if you're wanting more information about National Bereavement or some excellent resources, you can go to the Canadian Hospice and Palliative Care website, which is chpca.ca/grief day. And there will be some more resources that are available there. So again, tonight's sessions will be recorded and will be available on YouTube. And if you watch social media, you will see when those get posted. So we'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe. We offer our gratitude to our First Nations for their care for and teachings about our earth and our relations. May we honor those teachings. We acknowledge where we meet is the land and territory of the Anishinaabe people. We gather with gratitude to our Mississauga neighbors. We say miigwech to thank them and other Aboriginal peoples for caring for this land from time immemorial, and for sharing this land with those of us who are newcomers. Out of that gratitude, we are called to treat the land, its plants, animals, stories, and its peoples with honor and respect. We are all treaty people. We acknowledge that the land on which Hospice Peterborough is located is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Mississauga and in the territory covered by Treaty 20. So a few items before we get started. At Hospice Peterborough, we take confidentiality very seriously, but given the nature of this Zoom platform, we're somewhat limited in how confidential we can keep people's participation. So as I mentioned earlier, you are able to change your name. And if you're using the chat function and don't want your full name or want a different name to show up, you are able to change that by clicking on the bottom right-hand corner and renaming yourself. Also, if there are questions, comments, or feedback, we do have a support person. Natalie Warner is joining us tonight, and she will be monitoring the chat for questions and bringing those to our attention at the end. So that is the best way to get questions in. And then recognizing that when we're talking about grief, that can often bring up a lot of emotions. And so just knowing that supports are available. If you are finding that the content tonight is making you feel overwhelmed, my email will be available at the end of the session, or you can also contact local hospices for support. So we'd love to get a chance to find out who is joining us this evening. So we are going to do a poll to get a little bit more of a sense of who has logged into this session tonight. Alice, are you able to launch the polls?
Yes, I am. As everybody hopefully can see the poll, and we'll give you all some time to answer those questions, and then we'll share the results so that we have an idea who's joining us.
So the 3 questions that we're asking is what motivated you to register for this program? Where are you joining us from? So we know that we have a couple people who have registered from Western Canada, maybe potentially people who aren't even in Canada. And so I said somewhere else to give them a little Canadian flavor. And then what age are you and the people that you're watching with? You can choose more than one response for that if there's multiple people viewing the session together. And with all of our polls this evening, there is always the option to choose not to answer, and there is a selection, so you can let us know you don't want to answer the question.
I'm just going to give it a few more seconds. We have most people who've answered the poll. We'll just give it a little bit more time.
Okay, so it looks like most of you have joined. Are we able to share those? So most of you have joined because you are grieving a death in your own life. The majority of you are from Peterborough and the surrounding area. We have 9 of you joining us from somewhere else in Ontario, a few from Eastern Canada, and 1 person from Western Canada. And it looks like, oh, it's a pretty close split between people who are in the 19 to 44 and 45 to 64 age range. So thank you all for joining us, wherever you are. And before we get into the content, sometimes we can engage in these types of workshops. We carry our own grief backpack with us when we come in. And so we're just going to take a moment to ground ourselves and to take some breaths. And we're going to do a breathing exercise. So if you can find a comfortable and relaxed position to sit in, hopefully this will get us all into a relaxed frame of mind. So begin by focusing on your breathing. Breathe in and out. Take a cleansing breath in and breathe out the tension in your body. Feel relaxation beginning at the bottom of your feet. It might feel like stepping into a warm bathtub, or it might feel like a tingling sensation, or simply calm and loose. Allow the relaxation to spread over your feet. Notice as it moves up your legs, and allow the relaxation to continue to spread throughout your body, rising through your hips and pelvic area, your stomach, lower back, to your chest and upper back. Let your upper arms relax. Feel the relaxation spread down your arm to your hands. Your hands feel pleasantly warm, heavy, and relaxed. Allow your shoulders to ease back slightly. Notice as your neck begins to relax. Feel the relaxation spread throughout your head, your chin, mouth, cheeks, nose. Your eyelids feel heavy and relaxed. Your forehead feels cool and relaxed. Notice that your entire body is now feeling relaxed and calm. slowly become aware of your surroundings again. Notice how your body feels, how it's supported by the chair you're sitting in. Notice the sounds and smells. And allow your focus to return to our time together. I'll count to 3, and when I reach 3, you will be at your desired level of relaxation or alertness. 1, 2, 3. So we're now going to get into the content of why we've come together tonight. There seem to be some marks on the screen. I don't know if Natalie, you might be able to remove those marks that are on the screen, but we'll continue on with the presentation. So we're going to talk about what is grief, and based on that survey we did earlier, it's something that many of you have intimate knowledge of and are living with right now. So when we talk about grief, we're going to start with focusing on what grief is not. Grief is not a disorder. It is not a disease, and it is not a sign of weakness. Grief is a natural human process after experiencing a loss. What grief is it's an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity. And it's the price that we pay for loving somebody. And the only cure for grief is to grieve. And that's a quote from Rabbi Earl Grolman. So we're going to differentiate a little bit between grief and mourning. So we all have some of the terminology that we'll be hearing tonight. They may seem like very similar concepts, but what grief is it's our internal response after we experience a loss. It's all of those thoughts and feelings we have on the inside after a loss. What mourning is the face of grief. It's how we show our grief and process our grief with others. And one of the key pieces of mourning is engaging in rituals or ceremonies. And we'll touch a little bit more on that in the session that we have, our third session of the Grief 101 series that'll talk about grief and COVID. But mourning and that external expression and engaging with others, the social piece of grieving is a really important part of the grief journey. So many people are familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5-stage of grief model. And this is probably one of the most widely known models of grief. And this was first presented in Kubler-Ross's book on death and dying. And this model was actually developed in looking at the grieving process people go as they approach the end of life. But after Kubler-Ross presented this model, other people in the grief and bereavement field said, well, that seems like a really good fit for the work we're doing too. And so they started using this model as well. And there are some really great pieces of this, and there's reasons why this is one of the most common models that people know. So I'm just going to touch a little bit on the pieces on what this model is for those of you who might not be familiar. And then we'll talk about how this model can sometimes do a disservice to people who are grieving. So Kubler-Ross said that one of the first phases that people experience, or the first emotional responses following a loss, is denial. And this is the numbness after a death. This is that point where you can't believe that this is actually happening. And denial actually serves a purpose for us. It helps us as we begin to engage in this new reality and figure out how to deal with it. There's a protective mechanism to denial. And then she poses that we would then move into anger. And so this is the phase of grieving where you would be asking questions like, why is me? why me? Or life is not fair. Wanting to find somebody to blame for what's happened. And if you feel a connection to God or other religious figures, you might say, where is God? Why didn't God protect me or protect my loved one? Then there's a phase of bargaining that she poses. And this is when you may say things like, I would do anything to have them back for 5 minutes. I would make only healthy choices for the rest of my life for just another moment. And in this bargaining phase, often people will experience some guilt as well. And this is when you're saying all the what ifs around the death. What if I had got them to the doctor sooner? What if we had left 5 minutes later? So those are things that could happen in the bargaining stage. People often think the sadness and depression is something that happens in those initial stages, but often depression or feelings of deep sadness can crop up when we try to engage in daily life again. And there's this huge void that is uniquely shaped like your loved one, and you don't know how to re-engage in the things that you've done before with them not being there with you. And this might be a point where somebody who's grieving might say to themselves, what's the point in going on? I don't know how to do this. And then Kubler-Ross said, we get to a point of acceptance. And this isn't accepting that the death has happened and you're okay with it. It's accepting that your loved one is gone and that you're going to be okay. So while there are certainly representations of what people experience in grief in this model, what it doesn't reflect very well is that grief is not this pretty. Grief is very messy. It does not follow a series of stages. There is not one direction. With the wave of this model, you sort of think that you go through these stages one after the other. And what we know is that there's so many complicated emotions and they can all be experienced at different times. You may, quite a long time after your loved ones died, be feeling numbness. So it doesn't necessarily represent what grieving really looks like. And the other piece that it really does a disservice is it gives the idea that there is an end to grieving. You can see that that wave ends after acceptance. And what we know is grieving doesn't end. You learn to carry your grief and you learn to manage your grief, but it is something that is with you for the rest of your life, and that person is woven into the fabric of your being. I just quickly, before we move to the next slide, want to touch under acceptance, the third point there. She's used the term moving on, and that can be a really difficult phrase for people who are grieving. And I think if you have some time, there is a lovely TED talk that's quite short about moving forward. And I like that terminology a lot better, because moving on feels like you're leaving something behind when you reach a certain part in your grieving process, that you're leaving that person behind, when really you'll never leave them behind. As I said, they're woven into the fabric of your being, and you move forward with them and you move forward with your grief, but it's never left behind. So this cartoon kind of gives the idea of how the Kubler-Ross model has been used. You're on that journey of grief, and there's the exit, and you're going to take the denial exit now and come back on your journey, and then you'll hit anger and bargaining, and then after acceptance you'll be all done. But that is not what grief looks like. This is much more what grief looks like. We want grief to be this straight line and very clear and make sense, but grief is very messy. And when I was looking at this, I thought even this picture doesn't really do grief justice, because if those dots are starts and finish lines, but imagine that more like a road and the dots are cul-de-sacs. And so you kind of get back into it, and it's not a straightforward process. So the way that we find is more representative of grief is describing grief as a wave. And I loved this image because you can almost feel that wave coming down on top of you. And in the early stages of grief, it's hard to come up for air. It's like you get hit by one wave after another, and it's hard to catch your breath. And the waves are really, really big. And then with time and with support and with having opportunities to mourn the loss, the waves may get smaller or they may space out a little bit. And you do have opportunities to catch your breath and your grief doesn't take up as much space in the world. And then the other piece that grief is like waves is that sometimes as we go through the grieving process, there will be waves that we can see coming. There are things like holidays or anniversaries that we know are coming and we know are going to be hard and are going to feel like a grief wave. And we can plan for them so that we're able to manage those waves a little bit better. And there's also the waves we know. We know it's going to be hard to go to the favorite restaurant where we always met our friend who died, or going to the grocery store and going down the cereal aisle where your partner always bought the same cereal year after year, and seeing that cereal just brings on a wave of grief. And again, we can prepare for that or choose to skip the cereal aisle or find ways to cope with those waves when we know that they're there. But there's also waves that we don't see coming. There's the song that comes on the radio, or walking into somebody's home and it smells just like your mom's chocolate chip cookies. And then that brings on a wave of grief and it just catches us right off guard. And sometimes that can be early on in the grieving process, and sometimes that can be years down the road. And so that idea of grief being like waves feels like a better fit. So this is also touches on kind of the stages. It has a bit more of a spectrum of the different things that you may experience in grief. But this is the reality of grief, that you may be in a place where you're recognizing that there's been growth for you and there's new strengths that you have and you're feeling some hope. And then you can get something, you may get hit by one of those grief waves and you're back and feeling angry or numb. Sometimes when new information presents itself, it might bring back some of those feelings of numbness. So just recognizing that grief is not linear. You don't move through individual emotions and then sort of check that box off and you don't go back to it. No, you can keep coming back to different feelings over and over again, and many feelings can be present at the same time. Grief isn't orderly. You don't experience emotions one at a time. Often you experience an overwhelming number of emotions at once, and it's very messy. Grief isn't logical. Sometimes when you expect a wave, the ocean might be calm. You expect something to be really difficult, and then you find you're feeling okay. Or sometimes you're feeling numb, and that's okay too. That can be part of the grieving process. And grief doesn't end. You learn to carry your grief, you learn to manage and cope, and eventually your grief doesn't take up quite as much space in your life, but it doesn't end.
And I was just going to add, Sheila, too, I think secondary losses or other losses that happened after that initial loss or death can make that image of the back and forth and the squiggly lines come up again, because we're experiencing another loss, those feelings that remind us of experiencing a death come up again. And so I think there's a lot of secondary losses that can happen after a death-related loss as well that can make us relive all of those emotions over and over again.
Yeah, and so just quickly for people who may not be familiar with that terminology, secondary losses. So if you experience the death of your partner, secondary losses could be change to your work environment, changes to where you're living, changes to income, changes to your support network. You had all these couple friends and now it's harder to engage with them. So those are all secondary losses. So they're not the initial loss, but they're other things that you experience as losses because of that first loss.
So this is just another imagery that we picked out to sort of help explain or describe grief and sort of put it into ways that can really explain the hard parts of grief and the painful parts of grief. So I'll just go through the image a little, like bits by bits. We see there's a person in a canoe or in a raft, and they're trying not to go over that waterfall. So sort of that feeling of unexpectedness or shock around a death, and that can happen both in expected deaths. So if somebody is having a life-threatening illness and you've been there that whole time, shock and numbness can still happen even for expected deaths, as well as unexpected deaths when it's more sudden. And then we see after the waterfall, there's this whirlpool that also has some rocks and sort of a rocky section on the side, which is really to symbolize the painful and physical parts of grief. So when we grieve with our whole bodies and we can feel it in our bodies. And the whirlpool, it's undetermined how long someone might stay in that whirlpool. And it's really individual based on that person and their relationship with the person who's died and what kind of supports they have as well. And then we see sort of the river moving away from the whirlpool. We're talking about mourning, which is that outwardly expression of the grief. And then the river continues on where we might start to reorganize and work, try and figure out what does this new identity look like? What does this new life look like without my person? Another really important part of this image is the river kind of gets cut off at the end of this image, and we don't really know what's past the image. There could be other whirlpools, there could be other waterfalls, and there could be other rocks. And so that's again just to Sheila's point around grief doesn't end, it just changes and it looks different as time goes on. But in no way are we suggesting, or is this image suggesting that this river just sort of ends and that's where grief ends. Yeah.
So this is a quote from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and John Kessler, and it says, "The reality is that you will grieve forever. You will not get over the loss of a loved one. You will learn to live with it. You will heal and you will rebuild yourself around the loss you have suffered. You will be whole again, but you'll never be the same. Nor should you be the same, nor would you want to." So I feel like that quote really captures that piece of recognizing that this is something that you can manage and will, and find strategies to deal with. But it's always going to be a part of you, and you're going to be forever changed because of the connection you had with that person and the loss you've experienced. So we're going to touch on symptoms of grief, and we're going to start with a video from an organization in the UK called Young Minds. And we're going to watch half of this video now and then half in a few minutes. So this is just talking about what grief can feel like.
To anyone grieving.
To anyone who has lost someone close to them.
We want you to know that it's normal to feel sad.
It's normal to feel shock.
To feel fearful, scared, or anxious about the future.
Or worried about death.
It's normal not to feel anything at all.
Or to feel angry all the time.
Or to feel like you laugh too much, or cry too much, or sleep too much.
Or to not sleep at all.
It's normal to just want to scream.
It's normal to want to continue with your life.
Or to feel like everyone has moved on around you.
It's normal to feel confused, unprepared, or helpless.
It's normal to feel guilty or relieved.
Lonely, isolated, or abandoned.
or to want to be alone all the time.
These feelings may come all at once.
Or you might not feel anything for a while.
These feelings can come at the most obvious of times.
Or when you least expect it.
It's okay, it's normal.
So they said it very well. Grief can show up in a wide variety of ways, and all of these ways are normal. And it's going to be different for every person, and it's going to be different with every loss. Some people feel like they should know how to deal with grief because they've experienced other losses, but every relationship is unique, and every time you deal with a loss, you deal with it differently. So we just wanted to highlight that there's different ways that symptoms can show up when you're grieving. Physical symptoms, so having dry mouth, feeling exhausted all of the time. These are all considered normal responses to grief. Emotional symptoms, certainly feeling sadness, anger, guilt, but also recognizing that relief can be an emotional symptom of grief, that there can often be a sense of relief after a prolonged illness, or in a death where there's been complicated circumstances leading up to the death. And it's okay to feel that. Sometimes it can be hard to give voice to that, but it is an experience that is within the realm of normal emotional responses to grief. There can also be behavioral symptoms. So crying and sighing, being indecisive or forgetful, having mood swings. Those are all behavioral symptoms. Cognitive symptoms can include denial. Often people will talk about that fog that they experience, that they feel like they're kind of walking in a dream world and that this doesn't feel real. Those are cognitive symptoms of grief. And one of the cognitive symptoms at the bottom that you'll notice is hallucinations. And just to highlight that this speaks to the fact that it's normal to think that you see your loved one in a crowd, or to feel like you smell their cologne, even though you're at home alone. You can still have those cognitive responses. And then there's also spiritual symptoms, which sometimes get overlooked, and people can become very angry with the divine, or be really searching for meaning, a change in relationship with their religious community or their supports. So recognizing that all these and many others are part of the normal spectrum of what people may experience after a death, but also highlighting that there are certain circumstances where additional support can be really important. So if you're having symptoms related to trauma, where you're having flashbacks to an event or anything like that, it can be really valuable to engage in professional support.
And also that, and we're going to touch on this later, that there are strategies to cope with some of these symptoms too that, you know, naturally come with grief. So things like, I've heard people talk about in group about the forgetfulness piece, and that's a very common one, that they've now started to keep a notepad where they write things down to remind themselves of things. And it could be the small things, like to how to get dressed in the morning. Like, these are things that naturally come up when we're dealing with significant grief and loss. So we'll talk about coping down the road, but there are ways to sort of, you know, manage these things while they're happening.
Oh, sorry, Alice. So we're going to touch on different types of grievers.
Did we want to do the poll, Sheila?
Oh, thank you, Alice. Yes.
Well, I'm here.
So going back to symptoms of grief, when you look at that list of different types of symptoms, we're just wondering what types of symptoms either you've recognized in yourself or you've recognized in the person you're supporting. And yes, you can choose multiple as well.
We'll just give it a couple more seconds. Most people have already answered.
Okay. I think we can close that, and it's emotional symptoms seem to be the most common thing that people are experiencing, followed closely by physical and behavioral, but certainly cognitive and spiritual are experienced by a number of people as well.
And I think, I think the reason we were talking about what this kind of shows or demonstrates is that we all grieve differently, and we might have all different types of reactions or symptoms around our grief.
Sorry, my poll is still up. Okay, so now we'll talk about types of grievers.
So just in following up, talking about kind of symptoms and how we express our grief, there's really two categories that the literature talks about around how people express their grief and how they manage their grief. And this sort of picture kind of shows the two different parts, the two different types of grievers. And you'll notice that there is a woman cartoon character on one side and a male cartoon character on the other side. And that's just to say that based on what so Kenneth Doka, he's one of the main, he's one of the leading experts around grief. What the literature does tell us is that based on gender roles and based on how we are raised in like a gender normative way, women tend to fall in more intuitive griever section, and men tend to fall in a more instrumental grieve as an instrumental griever. And I'll just kind of break that down a little bit more. So intuitive grievers, it's really what you would see as a typical griever. If we were thinking about what we've seen in movies or what we've seen on TV, it's the emotional expression of grief. So the outwardly expression of grief kind of mirrors how we're feeling inside. People are more focused on exploring and expressing their feelings. And then we have the instrumental griever, which is more physical, cognitive, behavioral way of grieving. So these are folks that express their grief in more physical and behavioral ways, things like creating things, building things, doing activities, more than the feeling and wanting to express their feelings. So they're the people who might not journal, but may want to build a deck or go for a hike, things like that. The next slide, though, is I think really important to tie it all together, that really we kind of all fall into different categories depending on where we are at with our grief, what resources are available, and what kind of loss we're experiencing. A really good story that I can share with you all is there was a woman in one of the grief groups who was talking about the loss of her dad. And her dad's relationship with her, one of the things that they had was he was the fixer guy. He would come over and help fix things that would break around the house, help her build things. So that was their relationship. So after he died, she missed a lot of things, a part of the relationship. But what had happened after he died is her dishwasher broke. And her instinct was to call someone to come and fix the dishwasher. And instead, what she decided to do is to take the time to read the manual, to buy the tools that she needed to fix the dishwasher. And although in her story, she said it took days to fix this dishwasher, whereas maybe someone who came in would have taken a couple hours with it, and ended up fixing her dishwasher. And it was more than just an accomplishment for her, it was her grieving. It was actually her feeling close to her dad, who was no longer alive, by being able to do those things for herself. So I really want people to know that although the literature might suggest that women tend to be more intuitive, men tend to be more instrumental, and that is still true, that we can be both. We can shift from one end to the spectrum to the other, depending on what resources we have and where we're at. COVID certainly has changed a lot of that for us, and sometimes what we may have had before COVID, which we'll talk a little bit later in session 3, around counseling, one-on-one counseling and things like that, which might help an intuitive griever to work through those difficult feelings, may not be available depending where you are, where you're living, or what resources are available to you. So you may do other things that help you process those big feelings and those difficult feelings. So that's just to say that there is no right or wrong way to do it, but it might look different for different people.
And just a quote to say that in a society which is much more inclined to help you hide your pain rather than grow through it, it is necessary to make every conscious effort to mourn. And I think recognizing what your own needs are and that people will want to help you and want to guide you to what might meet their needs. It's okay to say, you know what, I don't feel like I need this. This is what I really need. So building off what Alice just said is sometimes instrumental grievers, people will misinterpret or believe that something they're doing is part of the grieving process, but what it actually is more of a grief blocker or something that's distracting you from actually processing the grief. And so things to watch out for are things like spending too much money, exercising excessively, overeating, working too hard. And then the big one is letting our bodies express our grief. So if we think we can pack up our grief and put it in a box and not deal with it and that it'll just go away, it doesn't. And sometimes it shows up in our bodies. It shows up in not feeling well, in illnesses. And so sometimes when you start to experience physical symptoms after experiencing a loss, it may be a time for you to reflect on, am I trying to avoid my grief? And so my body is doing the processing for me, and reaching out for some help from family, friends, and professionals. So we are going to touch on coping with grief. Tonight, we will be doing more discussion around coping with grief next week. And we're going to go back to our friends from the UK.
We all grieve differently.
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 Take each step, each minute, each day.
One at a time.
Remember to breathe.
Your grief is valid. Your feelings are valid.
It's okay to take time out for yourself.
It's okay to cry on the bus or the train.
It's not weak to feel.
It's okay to reach out for help.
Things can get better. People can help you.
Friends can listen. Family can comfort you.
Teachers can support you and doctors can look after you.
Others have been there and will be there for you.
You are not alone.
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 So that just touches on some things that can be helpful to cope when you're grieving. And this is another list to give some ideas of ways that you may begin to process your grief. So Alice talked about journaling being a helpful tool for some. Talking out loud to yourself or talking to your loved one is a normal part of the grieving process. Talking to friends, families, community supports, joining bereavement support groups. So we are continuing to offer bereavement support groups at Hospice Peterborough for death-related losses. And many hospices across the country are working to get such groups offered on virtual platforms. So you can investigate and see if there's something available close to you, but for those of you in Peterborough, there are things available virtually right now. Taking time to be alone can be really difficult when you're grieving because it feels so big when you're alone, and it leaves you with nothing but you and your grief and the void of your loved one. But it can be very important to help you begin to process everything that you're going through. And knowing that it's okay to feel bad, but it's also okay to feel happy. That's part of re-engaging. There doesn't need to be guilt around feeling happy. And making sure that you're taking care of yourself. One of the big key pieces when you're grieving is trying to avoid shoulds. I should be feeling better, or I should be feeling worse, or I should be doing more. That can't be helpful. What is helpful is to honor where you're at and to give yourself space and time to process what you're going through and engage in things that are comforting and allow you to connect with that person who has died. And when you look in the mirror and you think, I should be doing this, imagine a kind voice speaking to you, a voice of a kind friend, and what would they say to you? You're doing great, you're up and you're ready to face another day. So as I say, we will talk some more around what to do to cope with grief in next week's session. But we're going to do a quick poll just to see what coping strategies people have utilized, or if you're supporting somebody, what strategies have you seen your person use to cope with their grief?
Sorry.
It's okay.
And just while I'm setting the poll up, it's also just a comment on sort of the not so positive coping strategies. Back to Sheila talking about being kind to yourself. It's much easier to fall into those negative coping strategies because they come with instant gratification, or they fill an instant need, like numbing a pain or avoiding a pain or making us just feel better right away because we don't want to be with those big feelings. So I just wanted to add that it's okay if some of those negative coping strategies are part of your life right now, or part of the person you're supporting's life right now, but being aware that there are other strategies that you can engage in that will eventually help you feel a little bit more at ease with whatever you're holding on to or whatever you're carrying. But that it's not a judgment or criticism if you are experiencing some negative, or you're engaging in some more not so helpful strategies, because you're just trying. There's just a comment about wishing to select multiple answers for the poll. So that's okay if you fall into more than one of the categories. That's great that's part of your coping toolkit. And we'll keep that in mind next time as well for the poll.
And I have to apologize. That's an oversight on my part. This is the first time we're using polling, and I thought I had made multiple choices available on this one, but I must not have.
Choose your favorite one. But
Yeah.
we'll keep it in mind that you might have picked more.
So just looking at the results that are coming in, talking to a friend or family is a big one, but I also want to honor the fact that there's a number of you who say that you've taken time to be alone with your grief, and talking to the person who has died can bring such comfort, and nurturing that connection is really important. And again, we're going to talk about that more next week. So we are going to share a message from our friend Maureen Pollard, who has a website called griefstories.org, or is part of a website called griefstories.org. And it's just a clip of Maureen talking. It's a message for those of you that are grieving, and it sounds like that's many of you. Maureen is a social worker working out of the Port Hope area.
When you are grieving, when some loss experience has happened to you, one of the most important things is to trust yourself. To trust yourself to feel your feelings. You're strong enough to do this, and you will find your own way. People will tell you what you should do, and they'll offer you suggestions and sometimes even directions. And you can take those as invitations, and you can decline if you wish. You can find your own way. You can trust yourself to know that you'll know what feels right to you in your healing process. There's no real way to do this wrong, this grieving. If it doesn't hurt anybody, yourself or someone else, if it doesn't hurt anybody, then there's no harm in doing what you're doing to express your grief, to feel your grief, and to heal your grief.
So just before we wrap up, we're going to touch on where to go for support.
I just put the name of the website on the chat to everyone so they can see, they can check it out after the session or on a different day.
Okay, it's also on our online resources here.
Oh, it is, yes,
It
which
is.
I put this slide together, so I should have known that. But so just to go through some of the supports, and this is applicable to people in Peterborough or outside of Peterborough. We listed local hospice. So most local hospices nationwide have some form of grief support. It might look differently than what we offer, but that would be one way to reach out. Primary care physician, we put that down because I'm going to speak for Peterborough now, is that most primary care physicians are part of what's called a family health team. That family health team includes social work, which they would be able to make a referral to that team to offer one-on-one support. Usually it's time limited. And the other thing I would be mindful of if I am reaching out, if I were to be reaching out to my family health team, is does the person have bereavement skills or bereavement sort of background? There's lots of really skilled counselors and therapists that have a lot of different specialties. Some have bereavement and some don't. So that's just one thing that you might want to ask about if you are looking to reach out for support. EAP, so that's in relation to if you're employed or your spouse is employed and they have benefits, that's called the Employee Assistance Program. They might have coverage for one-on-one counseling, and that's something that you can look up through your human resources representative or supervisor at work. And lastly, trusted family, friends, neighbors, coworkers. This is a big one, and from the poll results that people responded to, this was a big one for them too. So recognizing that there are people, whether they be in your family or friends, neighbors, and then sometimes even coworkers, could be people that you can trust with sharing your grief. One of the things I think a lot of people shy away from in this group, specifically family, friends, neighbors, coworkers, is that we don't know how to start that conversation. We care about the person, but oftentimes people may be afraid to approach you or to even bring up your person who's died. It's okay to tell them that you want to talk about this person or bring them up in conversation. We'll talk about that again in the weeks to follow, how to do that, but you may experience people shying away from having that conversation with you or avoiding it, and it's okay to bring up your person and to let them know that you want to talk about them or you want to share a story about them. Below, you also find online resources. Grief Stories is what Sheila was just describing. They have excellent videos from professionals, but also people with lived experience on various types of grief and various types of losses. mygrief.ca, which is resources around Grief 101, similar to sort of the information we've relayed to you. And then Kids Grief is sort of the, I guess, like other type of support, online support that is specific to kids and teens. And they have support for people who are both caregivers and who are educators. So all excellent resources with evidence-based, practical information around grief and coping with grief.
Amazing. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. We are going to take some time. I'm recognizing it is 7:30, and I apologize. We wanted to make sure that it was worthwhile for you to be here, and apparently we've made it so worthwhile that we've gone over time with all the information we wanted to share with you. If you are feeling like you're in need of some support after this, my email is available. If you have feedback you'd like to offer us, my email is available. We are going to do a quick evaluation poll just to get some feedback so that if we offer this in the future, we know whether it was a good fit or not. Alice has launched the poll. So we're just asking if you'd be any more likely to join an online grief support group, if this session were to run again in the future, if you would recommend it. Sorry, did you find the information useful? And then the last question is, if you plan to attend additional sessions, are there certain topics you hope that we'll cover? And we ask you to add those to the chat box. If there's things that you really want us to address in one of the next 3 sessions, please add it to the chat box and we'll do our best to bring as much in. If there's additional feedback that you have, you can either share it in the chat box or you can send it to my email, which is on the screen right now. And just because with all of our poll questions, we need to have an answer, there is a spot there where you can say that you're going to put it in the chat, email me, or that you don't have additional feedback.
So we'll just leave that up for a little bit so people have time to answer the evaluation. It's going to help us to moving forward with the other sessions to help define it better and maybe add things that we maybe have forgotten.
So Natalie, I don't know if there were questions that came up throughout the session. I haven't been watching the chat box.
No, it was mainly technical, a couple technical things, nothing, no questions.
Oh, okay. If there's any questions that you have now, we do have some time, or you have my email. I'm happy to respond to those.
There is someone who doesn't see the poll on their screen. I'm hoping not a lot of people have that problem. If you do have any feedback and you can't see the poll for some reason, you can email Sheila at the email that she has on the presentation, any feedback that you have if you're not able to fill out the poll for if there's some technological issue. Thank you everyone who's come and who's leaving or who had to go to other appointments. I think this is so, it's so indicative of like how we're able to grieve in this kind of, in our culture, right? We're kind of going from meeting to meeting, job to job, obligation to obligation. And so I think that, Sheila, thank you for that mindfulness meditation at the beginning. I think it helped bring people into the room when we're talking about this, because oftentimes people are probably just coming from job, work, or feeding their kids or whatever before they sign in. And so that was kind of nice, and good luck with everybody else's plans for the rest of the evening. And thank you for coming for those who are leaving.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone so much for your feedback and for participating tonight. If you feel that the following weeks would be helpful for people that you know, there is still room to register for future weeks, so they can contact Amy Watson, our intake coordinator, whose email is on our social media site, if they'd like to register for future sessions. And thank you so much for your patience as we've found our way tonight and a few technical glitches. So I think that's all. Thank you so much and have a lovely night. We're going to hang out here just to get feedback from people and make sure that we can address anything as it comes up. Have a lovely evening.